Doctors Jonathan and Alex Marcotte present Improving Emotional Intimacy Within Marriage at the Love and Responsibility Lecture Series.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. It is a pleasure to be here and to be invited to do this second part of the Love and Responsibility series. I want to just start in a prayer, just in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, we just ask that you send your Holy Spirit into this room, fill our hearts with peace and hope as we learn about love and responsibility and taking that wisdom to enrich our lives and our relationships. Amen.
All right. So we just wanted to start by humanizing ourselves a little bit. Psychologists can be a little bit intimidating. We don't want to be that. So we're going to share a little bit about our story, about our experiences, both as therapists and as couples. So Jonathan and I have been together for about 7 years. We actually met at a wedding 7 years ago, breaking it down on the dance floor. Actually, literally while doing the Running Man.
I called it the shuffle at the time.
It's very confusing.
Yeah.
He was trying to teach me, but I'm not. I was more embarrassing myself. I think he was more breaking it down. But aside from this like great love of dancing and really cheesy dad jokes, we found that what we connected most on was psychology and of our deep desire to bring healing to people and to their lives. So this is really what kind of stirred the start of our relationship, but then also the start of our second vocation, which is as therapists. We knew that what we wanted most of all was to have faith as our guiding light while we were working. And so this brought us to Divine Mercy University, which is a graduate program that actually specializes in bringing faith and psychology together.
So throughout our education and training, we've lived in several places, and it was actually Alex's training and finishing up the program that brought us out here to Lincoln, where we've been able to start our practice, Sacred Ground Psychotherapy. So just a little bit, though, away from the professional. So like she said, we've been together about 7 years. We have 3 children who we call the little baboons. And they teach us about selfless love and connection every day and how difficult it is to maintain that. I mean, typically when we start a relationship, we kind of hope that it progresses to the point where it might look maybe something like this. You know, everybody's in the picture, maybe a few kids aren't looking, but at least everybody's smiling. When really it looks more like this one. I mean, Alex is chasing the toddlers. I'm in my own world, getting something out of my teeth. And this is just what life and love does. It changes over time, and it looks different, and it feels different. And we're here to teach you how when we integrate faith and the sciences, we can see the importance of those moments of disconnection and start to see them less as a bad thing and more as a signal that it's time to change. It's time to deepen the relationship. Father Kilcally did a beautiful job in the first part of this series, really honing in on John Paul II's teaching that the person must not be treated as an object or as a means to an end, but that the only proper attitude, but rather as a good towards which the only proper and adequate attitude is love. So what is love? I nailed that one. So love, as JP2 describes it, is made up of different parts, and each of them is some element of love, but none of them together are love. So he talks about love as attraction, which is a cognitive and emotional pull towards the good. Talks about reciprocity between desire and goodwill, desire being a longing for wholeness, which is good, it's deeply ingrained in us, as well as goodwill towards the other, which is a longing for the good of the other, and the importance that that has to be reciprocal between partners. Talks about sympathy in friendship, which is emotional openness and receptivity that leads to a secure and committed relationship. And he also talks about betrothed love, which is when the two I's commit to becoming a we. I'm going to focus on these parts in as much as they relate to romantic relationships between spouses or romantic partners. So John Paul II says that goodwill, which again is the desire for the good of the other, and desire, which is a longing for wholeness of the other, must be reciprocal. Otherwise, the relationship will not feel emotionally balanced, and we won't be able to love each other authentically. So if I just like being with Alex because I desire to be around her and have her attention, but I don't do things around the house, then it's not being reciprocal. If I just please Alex and do things that I think she'd like and take things off of her plate, I'm not loving her authentically because my needs and desires are not being met. They're not being reciprocated. But you have to have both in order to have authentic love. John Paul II says that it is reciprocity which determines whether that we comes into existence in love. Reciprocity is proof that love has matured, that has become coming between persons, has created a community of feeling, and that its full nature has thereby been realized. John Paul II also mentions that where there's reciprocity, we become a we. But when we're able to do this, and I'm able to rely on her to meet my needs, and I can meet her needs, and we can both rely on each other, then trust is built, which is the foundation for a good, healthy, authentic, loving relationship. John Paul II also talks about sympathy and how it's related to friendship. So sympathy is Greek in origin. Syn is a prefix, which means together with, and pathein means to experience. So literally together, sympathy means experiencing together. Now, it's important to note that in today's language, in today's definitions, this is more in line with how we understand empathy, which is sharing and understanding in the feelings of another, rather than sympathy today, which is known as more like pitying or seeing each other's emotions, but from afar, not together. But for the sake of this talk, I'm going to stick with John Paul II's term sympathy, but just know that it means empathy today. So what we know about sympathy is that it's incredibly important to love. And here's why. It's because emotions are the body's natural reactions to changes in our environment and our relationships, which means that it is our body's natural reaction, so it's our experience of life. We have emotional experiences of everything. And when we invalidate each other's emotional experiences, we start to feel distant. We start to feel unsafe, like we're not important, and like we're unloved. And maybe like there's something wrong with us, just on a natural level, because our natural experiences have been invalidated. In order to develop warm emotional relationships and connections with our partner, we need to be empathically attuned. And what this means is we are seeing each other, and we're being open to and responsive to and expressive of our emotional needs and their emotional needs. And when we do this, we're developing what psychologists call an internal working model, which is a perception of the other person that we keep within us at all times. And when we keep that perception within us in our internal working model, that the other person is loving and open and responsive to us emotionally, then we can build the trust, and we can weather storms in the future. When maybe we don't feel so distant, we still have an internal working model that we can go back to in our hearts that say, it's okay. They have the capacity to, or they can be. And we also know through our own experience that when sympathy is not in a relationship, then it typically feels overwhelming and cold. So it's important to continually feed this part of us. And when we are emotionally supportive and we're emotionally connected, a lot of studies have found, McCulsener of Bar Ilan University in Israel did a bunch of studies that looked at securely attached adults. So they have strong, good internal working models of each other that they can keep within themselves in the midst of tough, turbulent times. And they found that these couples that had these stronger emotional attunement could weather different storms. They knew that their couple, because we are imperfect, our spouse is naturally always going to disappoint us or hurt us. But if we have a strong internal working model of them built through sympathy and empathy, then we can weather those storms better. He also talks about betrothed love. Betrothed love takes friendship deeper. In betrothed love, we're surrendering to the other. It's when the two I's become a we through commitment. You can see this commitment be on paper through the legal marriage contract, or there's a mark on us when we're married within the church. But emotionally, it's a little bit tougher. It's not just a set label. It's kind of a feeling that has to be fostered and grown. So when we are in betrothed love and we've committed to being the other person's we with the other person, we're committing to know the other person, to be open with the other person, and to love authentically our person. And we're also committing to be known, to be transparent with, and to be authentically loved. And that sounds really nice, but this can actually be very scary because we have a lot of experiences that tell us that it's not good to be known sometimes in relationships. And if you think about when we're dating, I mean, how many of us, when we're starting a relationship, want our kind of darker spots to be seen by the other? Probably not many of us would raise our hands. This is because we want to be loved and seen as lovable, so we show other people our lovable parts. But as a relationship grows and continues on through time, we find that that's not enough. We start to feel like the relationship starts to plateau, starts to feel kind of stuck, kind of boring at times, maybe even hostile. And it's because we're not becoming vulnerable with each other. We're not giving each other things to be sympathetic to. So we're not bonding, we're not developing that internal working model. And if we don't do that, then we're not building trust in the relationship through different periods of time, and we're not building a resilience when things get rocky. So how do we get out of these negative cycles where we start to feel helpless and learn to soften?
Okay, so to answer this question, I want to go back to a quote that Father Kilcawley used in his first talk. And it comes from Pope John Paul II when he says, "To ensure that they do not become mere means, they must share the same end. Such an end where marriage is concerned is procreation, and at the same time, the continual ripening of the relationship between people." Continual ripening. I still get goosebumps when I use this word because it just hits me. If we look at what it means to ripen, ripening is to mature and to become tender, right? And tenderness is such an emotional word, right? To think of becoming tender with your partner, that when you look to them and you see on their face this softness, this tenderness, that when you share these deep, vulnerable parts of your heart, that not only does their face show you that you're loved, but their words and their voice, right? Tenderness is part of intimacy. Henry Nouwen says it really beautifully when he says, "When we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving much advice, solution, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand." Right? Tenderness is part of intimacy. And yet, because we are human and because we are breathing, we sometimes lose sight of this tenderness and this softness with our partner. And for most of us, this can happen over a matter of split seconds, right? Where things are going well and then all of a sudden they're not. It can feel like love starts to harden or that it spoils. For some of us, it might be at the sight of dishes in the sink. And for others, it might be when clean laundry is tossed right outside of the dryer, right? You're looking at it, you're like, what the heck is this, right? Love is hardening, right? And sometimes it's just the way that your partner is breathing today. We all been there. Love you. But Pope John Paul II reminds us, for love is never something ready-made. It is always at the same time a task. Love should be seen as something which in a sense never is, but is always becoming. Tenderness is not a trait. It's not something that you achieve and that you obtain and you're like, got it, I'm tender. It's so different than that because it's something that you're constantly cultivating that you return to. Time and time again, your heart is going to harden. And that's not because you're bad and it's not because you're not worthy of love. It's because you are human. Love and connection have seasons. Marriage is going to have seasons. I really hope you've been picking up on my subtle fruit analogy because I'm about to hit you with something really odd. Deciduous trees are trees that shed their leaves annually. This usually happens around autumn. The term deciduous means the dropping of a part that is no longer needed. And the reason it happens is for the tree to conserve water so that it can survive the winter. Marriage is exactly the same. When we start in love, like Jonathan was saying, most of us want to put our best foot forward. So we show the sides of ourselves that we love and that we like and that we think other people are going to delight in. More often than not, we're not showing the sides that we worry our partner won't love. Or even worse, maybe the parts that we think are so fragile, they're so soft, they're so tender, so they're so easily woundable that we don't want to show them because they could be hurt. Right? So we tuck those parts inside of ourselves and we don't show them. But eventually what happens is that this stops working, right? Love will not let us be anonymous. Love invites us out, and our partner will eventually turn and say to you, you don't need to keep your guard up with me. Let me in. And this is a very scary moment, right? You don't need to keep your guard up. What they're inviting is the same thing that happens for trees in autumn. They're inviting you to drop the thing that you no longer need, which is this mask, this guard that keeps them at arm's length and doesn't let them get close to your heart. So we drop this. And actually what this does, even though it's scary, is it lets your marriage conserve water so that it can survive the winter. It builds up love, it builds up safety and trust and connection, so that when the going gets rough, your love will see you through.
So another metaphor that I like to use for a very similar point is that of a lobster. So that's right. So when we said we're going to hit you with science, we're going to hit you with life science, not so much psychology yet. So think of marriage as kind of like a lobster. Lobsters are crustaceans, which means they have an exoskeleton or a hard outer shell. So how does something whose skeleton is on the outside of it and is hardened go from that big to that big? The answer is that the lobster, as it's in its shell, it's continuing to grow. And eventually, the lobster gets uncomfortable, and it says, okay, I got to shed my shell. And so it goes down to a safe place under a rock or something, and it sheds its shell, and then it emerges a bigger, stronger lobster. That bigger, stronger lobster keeps growing, feels uncomfortable, goes down into its hole, sheds its shell, comes out, and becomes a bigger, stronger lobster. And these lobsters do this several times until they become huge and good enough to eat. So what's to focus on here is that the catalyst for growth is discomfort. Discomfort is a good thing. It's a signal that tells you, okay, it's time to grow. So if you're feeling somewhat unfulfilled or uncomfortable in your relationship, that's a signal that it's time for something to change. Oh, what are you doing?
Oh, sorry.
No. So how this relates is that when we as a couple get to this point where we're feeling unfulfilled, we're feeling uncomfortable, it's time when we have to shed our outer shells, these parts of us that we're using to protect us, and we have to come together and become vulnerable, safe places for each other. Disconnection will happen, and it's not a matter of if it happens, it's a matter of when it happens. I want you to just keep in mind that when it happens, it's going to feel uncomfortable, but that it's an opportunity to grow deeper, to grow more, to shed our shells, and to become tender.
Okay, so this is probably the most psychologically based part of our talk so far. This next piece is, how do we actually do this? So how do we continually ripen, and how do we shed our shells? In the last 50 years, there's just been a growing science about love and bonding relationships. It's given us, therapists, but also everybody, a new way of understanding why is it that we get disconnected, and how do we reconnect? And like Jonathan was saying, the way is actually through emotional connection and vulnerability, which most of us hear vulnerability and we start to cringe. Like, that is just a very uncomfortable word. It is a very, I think, ambiguous kind of term. And even at its root, to be vulnerable literally comes from the word vulner, which means woundable, right? So in a relationship, we're talking about getting emotional connection and risking letting yourselves be wounded by your partner by letting them into these very precious parts of your heart so that they can know you better and so they can love you better. So to tell you a little bit more about this, I want to start with what we are called to, which as Christians and as Catholics, we know is love. But science is also finding that this is true. Mammals are attaching animals. I was going to use a baby and a mom, but I decided that the otter was a lot cuter. Proximity to our loved one actually soothes our nervous system, right? We know that we have been built for connection, and that actually having access to love is as important, and at times even more so, than food and water. There are countless studies of actually small mammals as well as children like dying, and I don't mean that figuratively, I mean that literally, dying, having a failure to thrive because there was not access to a loving relationship, or because they chose to prioritize loving contact over access to food and water. That's how potent it is in our nervous system. So having access to someone who loves you and is going to be there with you soothes our nervous system. It literally soothes our brain and our bodies. The same can also be said of isolation and separation, that it has an impact on our brain and on our bodies. We initially just thought that this was true for children, but more and more research has shown us that when our loved ones are nearby and they're accessible, we feel comforted. And not only do we feel comforted, but we feel more readily able to go out and to tackle life. When we feel insecure and our partner feels inaccessible, it actually is encoded as a danger cue in your brain and activates what we call primal panic, right? This is what instigates fight or flight or freeze in your body, is literally seeing even the back of a loved one turning away from you in a fight is going to trigger panic. So insecurity in our relationship is going to happen because we already know that you are going to fight, which to us means that we already know that your nervous system is going to go into distress. Most of us, when we have this experience, respond in one of two ways. Either we become overly anxious and start to cling and reach and seek reassurance from our partner, or we start to turn down the emotional volume, maybe become a little bit more distant, and start to become more self-reliant. It's usually one of these two. So Jonathan and I are exactly the same, right? We love to share with our couples exactly how we are in our relationship because it's human. Disconnection is going to happen, and you're going to use these ineffective methods to cope when you get distressed. It's better to know what you do than to not know what you do. So full disclosure, I am what's called a pursuer. On one side, we know that some people, these are the ones that get overly anxious and seek to cling and seek reassurance, they're more likely to turn up the emotional volume in the relationship. I can already see some couples turning towards each other and smiling like, that's you. Right? For pursuers, we're the ones that are not only turning up the volume, we might even be turning up our voice first. We're more likely to say like, hey, so it's 5:15 and you said you were going to get home at 5. Just checking. Just want to see how you're doing. I have dinner plans, but yeah, it's cool. Pursuers, we love to initiate contact. We love to get a fight going because we want to fight for connection. That is our greatest strength. We're loud. We love seeking reassurance, but most of all, we love knowing that the relationship is right there, and we love to check in on its strength. Withdrawers, on the other side, are a little bit different, and by a little bit, I mean a lot bit. They turn the emotion way, way down. They're more likely to be like, hey, it's fine, it's no big deal. I told you I was going to work late, right? It's not meant to be defensive. It kind of maybe sounds that way when it first comes out, kind of like pursuers can sound like we're nagging and we're critical. Withdrawers can sound like they become more defensive. They become more guarded. They might even start to move a little bit away from the relationship, right? Spending a little bit more time at work, maybe spending more time in their hobbies. There's distance now. They're becoming a little bit more self-reliant, but actually they have an incredible strength too. More than risking the relationship and saying something that maybe they don't mean or will hurt their loved one, they're going to take a protective silence. So while pursuers fight for connection, withdrawers protect this relationship with everything they've got, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty nasty cycle. Because now you've got someone who is turning up the heat, saying like, let's fight, and you've got someone who's like, whoa, lady. So, sorry, I did just generalize it.
Withdrawers and pursuers are not necessarily just men or just women. There are pursuing men and withdrawing women. Just a little note.
Sorry, anecdotal.
Examining personal biases.
Sorry, examining personal biases. Yeah, but we know that when we turn up the heat, our partner is more likely to start to turn it down, which for most pursuers, when we start to see that heat's going back down, we're like, no, come on back. We're going to fight this out. Like, aren't we going to talk about this? And more often than not, we'll chase our partner from room to room, right? Which the more that we chase, the more they double down. And they're like, no, I'm not going to risk this. This relationship means way too much to do that. So we turn it up and they turn it down. And before you know it, we're caught in this very nasty cycle. So which one are you? I mean, don't answer. That's rhetorical. But observe it, take this in, and start to feel out for yourself. Which one am I? Which method am I more likely going to use when I start to feel that distress in my relationship? And we'll tell you why we're doing that in a minute. But first, we have this great example.
So we really want to illustrate this concept of the cycle. And The Incredibles does a great job of that.
I thought you'd be back by 11.
I said I'd be back later.
I assumed you'd be back later. If you came back at all, you'd be back later.
Well, I'm back, okay?
Is this rubble?
It was just a little workout. Just to stay loose.
You know how I feel about that, Bob. Darn you, we can't blow cover again.
The building was coming down anyway.
What? You knocked down a building?
It was on fire, structurally unsound. It was coming down anyway.
Tell me you haven't been listening to the police scanner again.
Look, I performed a public service. You act like that's a bad thing.
It is a bad thing, Bob. Uprooting our family again so you can relive the glory days is a very bad thing.
Reliving the glory days is better than acting like they didn't happen.
Yes, they happened. But this, our family, is what's happening now, Bob. And you are missing this. I can't believe you don't want to go to your own son's graduation.
It's not a graduation. He is moving from the 4th grade to the 5th grade.
It's a ceremony.
It's psychotic. They keep creating new ways to celebrate mediocrity, but if someone is genuinely exceptional,
This is not about you, Bob. This is about Dash.
You want to do something for Dash? Then let him actually compete. Let him go out for sports.
I will not be made the enemy here. You know why we can't do that.
Because it'd be great!
This is not about you!
So this is a great example of a negative cycle. Raise your hands if you think that Bob is the pursuer. Good job, yeah. All right, Bob's the withdrawer, Helen's the pursuer. So that is a nasty cycle. And everybody has a cycle. Everybody gets into this. There's really no avoiding it. It will happen. So Alex and I, we've been trained in this method, emotionally focused couples therapy. And we still get stuck in our cycle, but the difference is now we can get out of it much faster. It doesn't last minutes, days, weeks, months, years, decades. It lasts, maybe it lasts a little bit of those. Probably closer to like a few hours before I'm thinking, okay, suck it up. Talk about myself. Where'd it go? Touching my stuff. So if you notice there, you see Helen turn the volume way up. She's kind of in that panicky mode. And Bob is also in his own form of panicky mode. He turns it way down. You notice how they start by yelling at each other, and then it kind of spins out of control, talking about a bunch of other stuff, like Dash's graduation. Thank you. And that's just kind of how the cycle goes. And you'll notice at the end of this fight, there was no resolution. They were still stuck in it at the end. And you know what? For 80% of couples, one of us typically does take the pursuer and one takes the withdrawer role. The others are like 2 withdrawers, 2 pursuers. But most of us do take this sort of dance in the relationship during the cycle. And it's a perfect example of when Goodwill, Sympathy, and Reciprocity goes out the window. It's what JP2 calls 2 egoisms or 2 I's. So they're no longer the we. They're no longer thinking about the good of each other. They see each other as, well, the trust is gone, so they don't trust the other to get their needs met. They don't trust themselves to meet the other person's needs. And so they go into their own sort of self-containing survival mode. And that is typically when utilitarianism sets in. So another way that I like to describe this cycle is kind of like it's by playing a game of tennis. Raise your hands if anyone here plays tennis. All right, yes, got a handful. What about who here has ever played ping pong? All right, more of my people. I've played tennis once. I either hit the net or I hit it over the thing, and I didn't like that. So I went back to ping pong. But what I noticed about the game of tennis is that it's a lot like getting stuck in the cycle. So when we're playing tennis, we're focused on the ball. Or ping pong, we're focused on the ball. We want to win. But the only way to win is by keeping an eye on the ball and making sure you hit it in the right spot. So when we're doing this, we're so focused on winning that we forget what's really important. And what's really important isn't the game. It isn't winning the battle, which is short-lived. It's winning the person on the other side of the net. When we stop playing the game, what we can do is we can look at what's really important here. I mean, true show of hands, who thinks it's better to win an argument than it is to continually come home to your significant other when you're in the middle of a fight and you're in the middle of the cycle and home just feels like death? Can you raise your hands? We're in sync. No.
It does. It feels better.
I was saying it was the opposite.
I think the temptation is that you think it feels better.
Oh, she
Right.
spinned it.
Yeah.
That was good.
Yeah,
It does feel good to win the war, to win the battle, but to win the war does not. We're connected again. We've reconnected. Perfect. Is getting out of our cycle. Yeah, cycle diffused. So, what do we do when we're playing tennis? How do we get out of this? Well, what we have to do is we have to put down our rackets. And it's not up to your partner to do it first. It's up to you. And when you do this, as Pope John Paul II says, it's time to intentionally reunite and see the same truth, which looks a lot like, hey, Alex, I realize we're in our cycle right now. And I know you're not the bad guy. The cycle is the bad guy. And I want to reconnect. So that's the first step. Alex is going to talk about the other ones.
The next really big step is that you want to take responsibility for your side. This isn't, you don't have to go super deep at this stage. It's just saying like, hey, I know that I got stuck. I got stuck in that thing where I wanted to prove that I was right and that I got really big and loud to do it. And maybe you're not ready to say sorry, and that's, oh, sorry. Now you can hear me. I think it's about taking responsibility in a way where you're just owning what you've said, maybe what you've done, the ways that you've embodied either that pursuer or that withdrawer. Like, I got big and I got loud, and we're going to teach you the next step. I almost blended them right there. I'm trying to show you a distilled one. I got big and I got loud, and I realized that didn't help. That's not helping. So I want to stop, and I want to just look at the cycle with you and why we got caught in it. The next step that I almost just did preemptively is you want to vulnerably share what was actually happening on the inside of your heart. Right? This is that ripening. This is that chance. It's time to come out of the shell. And the way that you do it is by risking and sharing what got you there in the first place. For Helen, this might have been, you know, I'm sorry I got so big and I got so loud. I really started to feel like we haven't been a priority to you, right? She says, you're missing this. You're missing this right here, right? She's trying to tell him, I feel like you're missing me. You're missing our kids. I don't feel like we're a priority. And when I don't feel like I'm a priority, I get scared, right? That is what's triggering the primal panic in her brain. I mean, sure, burning buildings, maybe that's a concern of hers, but this is Mr. Incredible. Like, there are a lot of other fears structuring what she's saying. And her taking a risk to say, I was getting really scared that we weren't a priority, is what deepens their relationship. And him coming back and saying, you know, when you do get big and you do get loud, I start to panic, because I feel like no matter what I say, I'm going to get it wrong. And so it's easier for me to turn and to go than it is to stay. But I don't want to feel like I don't have a voice with you. I don't want to feel like what I have to say doesn't matter. Right? This is just the beginning. This is just the unfolding. This is where the ripening is starting to happen, because they're no longer talking at the level of the cycle and in the panic. They're now talking at the level of vulnerability. And we know that vulnerability, like the way Christ was vulnerable, right? Literally woundable, letting himself be wounded on a cross. That was the only way that we could achieve the resurrection, right? Couples are exactly the same. So vulnerability helps us return to this tenderness, right? I don't know if you guys could actually feel that as we started to talk about it. Our nervous system actually starts to shift as soon as our voice tones change, right? So if I go from being really loud and arguing and saying, how dare you do that? Like, you cannot treat me that way. And then I shift and I come back down and I say, I'm so sorry. I got so scared. I got so scared that I would lose you, that I got big and I got loud, but that's not where I want to be. It actually physically changes your nervous system, and voice tone, even physically just changing your voice tone, is the most unambiguous cue of safety to your body. and your partner's body to say that this is safe, this is okay, we can become tender again, we can go back to that ripening. This is ultimately what facilitates that deeper sense of safety and of warmth and connection, and allows for sympathy, right? That coming alongside, that being with, it allows for that again, because it's no longer emotions that are pushing you away, it's emotions that are inviting you to come close. And so sympathy it literally almost naturally happens. So we have a video to show you to model this. We love that video. I know that in this video, it looks like it's between a child and parent, but the same thing is what happens when couples share vulnerably together. It's this beautiful thing where even something terrifying and scary, like wounds in your relationship, maybe things like betrayals or lies or infidelity, can actually become incredible moments of rebonding. And we don't just say that because we've seen it time and time again, but because we know from experience how taking a risk and being vulnerable completely restructures your view of the relationship and your partner as safe. So we made a handout to offer you guys really practical help, but even before you get it, we wanted to tell you a little bit about what's on it. The first thing that we put was we laid out the pursuer and the withdrawer side so that you and your spouse can look at it together, hopefully not hash it out, but hopefully it comes more naturally to say, I really feel like it's this. Like I feel like I am more of a pursuer. I recommend, and I don't mean this jokingly, I mean this very seriously, I really recommend that if you are going to do this with your spouse, only look at it from the perspective of yourself. Don't try and name what your partner does. It probably won't go well. We don't want to get your cycle going. We're just trying to help. You're good people. We just want to help you guys. So I would say only focus it from your perspective. So about what you feel you embody yourself. Are you more of a pursuer or are you more of a withdrawer? So you have those kind of listed, just a few examples to kind of get the ball rolling. The next thing we said was when you're caught in this cycle, we wanted to offer a few questions for you guys to be thinking about to help get to that continual ripening, to help get you to that removing of the shell conversation. And the first one is, what am I most afraid of in this relationship? Right? This, not in life, in this relationship, right? When the going gets tough, what do I keep coming back to as my fear? And the next one is, what do I long for most with my partner? Right? These are two incredibly important questions because they're going to structure how you respond. Right? If I'm afraid that I'm going to get it wrong, and I keep getting worried that I'm going to get it wrong or say the wrong thing, I'm less likely to speak up and say something, right? Whereas if I get scared that my partner is going to leave or that somehow I'm not going to be enough, I might fight for him even more. You can hear how it structures that panic response, right? When we tap into the fear, we know, why is it I'm responding this way? What am I doing and why am I doing it? The next question is, based on these questions, right? What is one practical thing that you feel fits for you and for your relationship that you can vulnerably do and share your heart? Just one, right? Not unpacking a ton, just choosing one thing. And the next thing is, what is one thing I can do after hearing my partner maybe share, or by imagining what my partner usually does? What is one thing I could do better to listen, to really listen, right? With that sympathy, with that goodwill, with that reciprocity, right? Becoming a we, knowing we get caught in our cycle, but you are good and you are worthy of love. I know you are human and I know that you are going to upset me. Sometimes you will get my panic going. I'll say things I don't mean, but that you are good. How can I listen with that in mind, extending out that compassion so I can allow myself to be moved by what my partner is saying and feel with them, right? Because feeling with your partner is actually going to be the biggest facilitator of change. It's not just sharing, but it's allowing ourselves to be moved by what they're saying. Just like Riley's parents did, right? We saw that her first thing that she shares when she's done, she says, please don't be mad. She's scared that this is going to get that cycle activated. And did you notice what they did? They immediately softened and they let themselves be completely moved by what Riley had said. And they said, honey, we're not mad. Like, we miss it too. And they're feeling it together. Right? This is a bonding event. And we know that because emotions and the way that we share and we vulnerably express and come together, this is the actual Velcro of relationships. So that's kind of what we have to offer today.
So just as a little side note, so Alex and I offer couples workshops.
This is a shameless plug.
Yeah, we're plugging. We offer couples workshops. We have one that's scheduled on February 2nd, 1st and 2nd. And so if you like this and you want more of this, then I honestly would love to welcome you and to have you attend it.
We break it down into steps. We have 9 steps. So 9 steps that we use to facilitate this over hopefully a weekend. Sometimes it's a little bit more, but for this workshop, it's just a weekend. It's a 1-weekend commitment to learn the 9 steps that we do this over, breaking down what we've already shared to make it more tangible.
So I'd like to just end in a prayer in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, thank you again for bringing us together this day to help us understand your love and what you intend for our love with each other. Thank you for the wisdom from John Paul II in Love and Responsibility and this opportunity to explore his teachings. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
So we're going to open it up for questions. Because it's recording, we're going to, as best as we can, repeat the question so that where this is being streamed to, they can hear what the questions being asked are. So whenever, if you guys have any. Yeah, so the question is, what do we do with the other 20%, right? If it's not pursue, withdraw, is this right? If it's not pursue, withdraw, if it's maybe 2 withdrawers or 2 pursuers, or maybe even something that feels like it looks a little different, do we use the same model? We do use the same model, and it's actually just as effective with every type of couple that there is, in terms of like withdraw, withdraw, pursue, pursue. The only difference is that it's going to feel a little bit different, right? It's going to feel like if you have 2 pursuers, then people are going to get really big really fast. This is me with my 4-year-old daughter. We actually just had a really, like even before this, a couple hours before this, I was having a conversation with her in the car. Like, you can't, just because you don't want to sit next to your brother doesn't mean you can tell him that like you hate him and that you don't want to be near him. So I was like, we use our kind words. And we got into our cycle because she was like, I don't want to use my kind words. Yeah. And eventually, I don't know if it's just by like being a daughter of 2 therapists. She eventually says, Mommy, you're being sassy and I'm being sassy. That was our cycle. Yeah. And you know what it did for me was that even just hearing her say it like that, which like she hit it on the head, was that it took me out of it. I realized like, oh my gosh, she's right. I'm spiraling with a 4-year-old. Like, what am I doing here? And it helped me exit the moment to say, wow, what I'm doing isn't working. I need to speak to her on like a more vulnerable level. Something else was happening that I didn't realize was going on. So it helped me like exit that moment, exit my sassiness, help her exit hers, just to reconnect and to rebond. It would look probably a little bit different, but the vulnerability is still the same. So the how changes a little bit in terms of you both are withdrawing. So someone's eventually going to have to like poke, or if they're both pursuing, it's going to take one of you to take that big risk and put down the racket. Because with 2 pursuers, the temptation to fight and ping pong or tennis is infinitely more. They just go back and forth. So someone's going to put down the racket, or someone's going to have to take the risk and be vulnerable. But ultimately, the steps are the same.
Yes, we see that a lot. That actually has a different name when we're conceptualizing the cycle. So that's what we would call a reactive cycle. And so oh, sorry. She's asking, the question was, what if the roles in the cycle change over time, and what does that mean? Right. And so what that means is that we've entered into a reactive cycle. So if you think of a pursuer as someone who kind of knocks at the door of a withdrawer, you know, they're going to knock first and say, hey, are you home? And if the withdrawer is activated, is going to say no or not say anything. And then the pursuer is going to knock a little harder. The withdrawer is going to be a little bit more activated, get quieter. And then the pursuer will knock louder and louder and louder until the pursuer just stops knocking. And then the pursuer thinks, well, I can't really rely on you, so I'm going to rely on myself. And it's a sad place to be. But when this happens, the pursuer becomes what we call a burned out pursuer, where they take on more characteristics of a withdrawer, but they still have the nervous system of a pursuer. They would still pursue if they felt safe, but they don't. So now they're more withdrawn. And usually what this activates in the withdrawer is what we'd call a reactive withdrawer. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, reactive withdrawer. It's getting the words jumbled in my head. And the reactive withdrawer now sees their pursuer is distancing and disappearing on them. And they start to say, oh, wait, I really got to step it up. I got to bring up my game and pursue. And so usually the approach to that sort of cycle is a little bit different, but it's usually saying the same things. It's talking about the vulnerable, it's getting each side, each couple down to their more vulnerable places so that they can share them with each other. And then as we notice, as the pursuer starts to feel more safe, then they start to take on more of the pursuing role again. And the withdrawer becomes more withdrawn again. We're taking on their role again, but they're able to communicate more from those places in a healthy way. So they're communicating healthily from their baseline.
The question is, do you have any suggestions for maintaining the vulnerability on a day-to-day basis? How do we stay vulnerable when we are busy, dealing with kids, etc., rather than just becoming vulnerable again when we hit the cycle? That's a really good question. Some of it is taking intentional time for you and your spouse, but you say that to a room full of parents and they're going to laugh at you because it can be really impossible to carve out that time. I would say it's still about taking intentional time as you can, right? It's kind of like in therapy, we practice mindfulness, and this is like deep breathing and how do we de-escalate from anxiety. When you practice mindfulness, the only way to use it effectively when you have a panic attack is to practice it when you don't have a panic attack, right? So taking intentional time and practicing vulnerability is going to like almost strengthen that muscle for when it does need to kick in. You guys are gonna be like super buff and ready to take that on because you've flexed those muscles several times at that point. So I would say even just carving out 10 minutes of your day to check in and to really say, like, not how was your day, what'd you do, but like, how was your day? And feel with your partner. The practice that you want to get really good at is feeling with what they're saying, so that when they're saying like, and then some jerk cut me off, you're like, what? Like, you know, like you just join in it. Get in that action.
Don't empathize with the jerk.
Yeah,
Don't say
that.
maybe he was having a bad day. Don't.
Yeah.
Okay, this one is from Robert. I presume that the vulnerabilities you begin with are not as heavy as the vulnerabilities you share after you have some experience under your belt, right? Maybe some examples would help people.
I definitely agree with that. You want to start with some softballs, to be honest. You want to start with things like your day. Like, how was your day? Talking about your day. The more that you can build up safety and your partner respond to you in those like easy moments, the more it's going to be easier to get into it when things get rough. So a low ball thing might be, let's think. I'm trying to think of do you have one off the top of your head? So I'm going to go back to Helen and Bob because we all just watched it together. Helen, I would say at one of her more deeper vulnerable points is probably feeling like she's not a priority, right? She gets really scared that somehow she is not important to her partner. And when she gets scared that she's not important, when she's not a priority, when she's not a pot that's on the burner, that's when panic sets in. But what it first comes out as is that anger that we saw, right? Like there's even this like terrifying moment where she goes and you think she's touching his shoulder tenderly, and then she like pulls up rubble. It's like a terrifying moment, right? What you want to lean into first as an early vulnerable moment is, I got big and I got loud because I don't know where you are and I want to reach you. And when I don't think I can reach you, I feel like I just need to get louder, right? She's not saying, I need you to prove to me that I'm a priority. She's not like demanding anything. She's not asking for anything at this point. All she's sharing is like a little softball of, I get big because I want to reach you. And if I think I can't reach you, I just get louder, right? It doesn't sound like it's probably a lot to say that, but actually when you're in the moment, like, maybe this is personal, maybe this is TMI. It's just like sweating. You're like, oh my gosh, this is riskier than I thought it was to say something so simple as just as I feel right here, right now. Like I'm scared to say this to you because I don't want to mess this up. I get worried about getting vulnerable because I get scared I'm going to mess it up. Even that is a great softball, right? You don't have to go any deeper than you're ready, but even just sharing how you feel about being vulnerable is a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, great question. Love this. Okay, so this question is, how do you balance like putting logic in with emotion, right? Like if there is a reason behind something, how do you maintain that in the midst of being kind of in an emotional, turbulent discussion? Is that right? All right. So, what if scenario? Yeah, never happens. So this is a beautiful thing that I think probably most men, myself included, tend to fall into, which is that reason versus emotion piece. So to really answer this question, I have to explain a little bit more about emotions. So like I said before, emotions are the body's natural reactions to changes in our environments and our relationships. So the body's natural reactions. Our body actually has a natural reaction 600 milliseconds faster than we have a cognitive thought about what's going on. So if our body, and also our body through our emotions is telling us that something's different, something's happened. So if we feel an emotion coming alive right here or here, that's usually sadness. If we feel it coming alive right here, getting tight, it's usually anxiety. If you feel it in our upper body, a lot of energy coming to our arms, it's usually anger. If it's going to our legs, that's usually fear. If we can know what our emotions are based on what our body is teaching us, then we can use it to inform us of what's happening around us. That being said, something really also important, and I'll get to the reason in a bit, is that emotions live outside of time. So if we have experienced pain that has been unprocessed years ago, maybe in childhood, maybe a week ago, maybe there's that thing that your spouse holds against you and it's been like 10 years. Anybody relate to that? I don't, because I haven't known her for 10 years. But but what we find is that because emotions live outside of time, there is a logic to emotions. And so the issue here is that we don't always know what that logic is. And so when we're becoming vulnerable and we're putting down our rackets, we're making space to say, hey, what's going on? This is different. You went from 0 to 100 and I am confused. And there's other logical things happening here that are important to keep in mind. But in the midst of an emotional discussion where an emotion is being activated, sometimes unprocessed pain, as we call it, those emotions from a long time ago that really hurt, they can get activated by little things. It could be as simple as maybe not making eye contact in the morning over breakfast, or it could be something bigger like an affair. It's going to trigger something or start something. So approaching emotions like they have their own logic is key to getting vulnerable. And when we are taking that rational step back, we're sort of taking a stance that it's invalidating the emotional experience. And remember, emotions are probably our most basic element of experiencing life in the present moment. So when someone says we shouldn't feel a certain way, or that we don't feel a certain way, or we should feel a different way, we're invalidating our experience of life in the present moment. And then we start to feel like, oh, is there something wrong with me? Am I worthy? Am I wrong? Am I a mistake? And we can't do that with each other. So avoid that pitfall of saying that emotions aren't reasonable. And yes, there are reason to it. And it is probably the hardest thing that men have to do when we get stuck in these cycles, is put aside that feeling that like, this isn't logical, this isn't reasonable. That's part of our withdrawing. And sometimes we go to that place as men because we don't know what the heck to do with emotions. No one taught us empathy. And that's a real shame, because we're not able, it's hard to love authentically without it. Does that answer your question, more or less? Clarified? Yeah. So I guess in full answer to your question. When that happens, notice that it's probably a defense mechanism. It's probably coming from some place of powerlessness that you so want to help your loved one and you don't know how. And so you're moving away from it emotionally. And just notice that it's okay. Everyone does it, even women to some extent.
Yeah. And if it doesn't make sense, if the emotion isn't logical yet, it means you haven't gone deep enough. So you basically go as far as it takes for you to feel it with your partner. So if it's still not logical, if it's still not making sense, if you're like, I still don't get it, that is actually an invitation to even go further and be like, I don't understand, but I want to. I want to get it. Like, it's not logical to me yet. That's actually like a great way to say it. It's not logical to me yet, but I want to get it. Right? And it's just a way of entering and showing like, it matters to me. Your heart matters to me, and I want to know it. And even though maybe it's not hitting me right off the bat, like, I'm going to stick with it until I get there.
February 1st and 2nd. It's that first Saturday, Sunday of February. Yeah, you can also check us out at our website at www.sgpsych.com.
And it's all the info.
It has all the info for it. You can sign up for it there. We also have brochures and pamphlets out there, and it'll give you all the information you need. All right. Thank you all for your time.